Welcome to Curb Enthusiasm, a podcast by New York City DOT. My name is Emily Weidenhoff, Assistant Commissioner of Public Realm.
And my name is Natasha Bartley, Director of Administration for the Office of Livable Streets.
We talk to guests who share insight on what's new, exciting, and innovative in the world of transportation and urban planning. We focus on issues at the local, national, and international level and hear about some of the most consequential work happening in transportation across the globe.
Our first guest is Polly Trottenberg, U.S. DOT Deputy Secretary of Transportation.
Today, Polly reflects on her career as New York City DOT Commissioner, shares insight about her work at the federal level, and gives advice to future transportation professionals. So we are super excited today to welcome U.S. DOT Deputy Secretary of Transportation, Polly Trottenberg. Welcome back to 55 Water.
Thank you.
I have to say, every time you're here, it always trickles down. You know, there's always this like buzz and excitement. Definitely a lot of love and appreciation for you across the agency. And we're excited, really excited when you're here.
Thanks, Emily and Natasha. Great to see you guys again.
Thank you.
We've all spent some time together in the trenches.
Yes.
Want to talk a little bit about the climate crisis. The Biden administration has really focused on the climate crisis, especially what the transportation sector can do. So really curious about your perspective in terms of thinking about solutions to what is a very complex set of issues.
Yeah, as we endure yet another one of the hottest record-breaking summers and wildfires and floods and all the rest of it. Climate change is real. And, it's interesting. One thing, Secretary Buttigieg likes to say is, transportation, at least in the United States, is the biggest source of carbon emissions, biggest source of the problem, so to speak, but therefore can potentially be the biggest source of the solution, which I think is a very inspirational way to look at it. And again, this administration is really committed to tackling climate change. That is not always easy, particularly at the national level. There is a lot of lively debate and dissension about what we do. But we are focused, I think, on a bunch of things in the transportation sector that make a huge difference. First of all, record-breaking investments in transit and rail, in providing people with options. Record-breaking investments in roadway safety projects, in walking and biking projects. We are building out a national EV charging network. It's going in fits and starts, but the work has actually progressed better sometimes, I think, than you would know from reading the headlines. We have already doubled the number of publicly available chargers that are out there since the president came to office. We're on track to keep building those out. It's another piece of the puzzle. Every single one of these builds together. But one thing that I have also realized, transportation is not going to solve climate alone. And one thing our agency did, working with HUD, Housing and Urban Development, and EPA, is put together more of a holistic transportation decarbonization plan, which is particularly looking at the piece that we also know we need to focus on, which is land use and housing. You have to do that together with transportation. And look, New York is a place, obviously, where you have a lot of density and a great mass transit network for big parts of the city. In other parts of the country, that's a much bigger challenge. A lot of other parts of the country, put together in much more auto-centric configurations, and to sort of come back and try and find ways to put in transit to increase density can be a heavy lift, but that has also got to be in the long-term part of the solution.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we see that a lot in our work with city planning, that the more we work together with land use and transportation, the stronger the outcomes we can actually leverage.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that's more challenging at the federal level, each agency like Department of Transportation or HUD or EPA or Department of Energy has very separate congressional authorizations and mandates and funding streams. It can be very stovepiped. But one thing we've gotten to do is create a joint office of energy and transportation, which is, in previous years, Department of Transportation, Department of Energy didn't actually work as closely together as you might think. But now, in an era where we're trying to decarbonize the transportation sector, we are joined hand in glove. We work together every day, to implement the EV charging network, but just in a whole bunch of other ways too. And it's been an incredible partnership. So going forward, I think people are like, what would be things you'd want to go back and talk to Congress about? I think continuing to encourage closer relationships between DOT and energy, between DOT and HUD, letting us combine some of our dollars and some of our programs and really work more closely together. I mean, that's, I think, the long-term path for really decarbonizing.
So, spill the beans on US DOT's top priorities and your proudest accomplishments.
All right. Well, obviously, was just here in New York with the governors and Senator Schumer and a whole group of folks celebrating putting all the federal funding together to do the Hudson River Tunnel.
Oh,
That is a huge, exciting project, one that will, I think, benefit us, our kids, and our grandkids. Probably one of our most exciting projects, one that I have been on and off had some hand in for like almost a couple decades now. So really amazing to see it come to fruition. But in addition to that, as you guys know, we have the privilege of implementing the largest transportation bill probably ever in American history, and having the chance to fund all kinds of amazing projects all over the country, including a bunch here in New York City, some right here with New York City DOT. You know, particularly one program that I think has captured everybody's imagination is Reconnecting Communities, which is going back and looking at those legacy highways from the interstate era. A couple big ones here in New York City, BQE, one that I know well, Cross Bronx, you know, obviously highways that rip communities apart. And it's interesting, right? New York, you're not alone. Like I can see from the national perspective, there's almost not a city in the United States of any size that didn't have a highway that was sort of put through the middle of some neighborhoods, often low-income neighborhoods, neighborhoods of color. There's now an estimation that as many as 1.5 million people were displaced in the interstate era. And now we have a program to try and start to figure out how we knit those communities back together again, undo that legacy. And it's very challenging, as I know from my time here in New York. Once you build these big highways, it's easier said than done to just figure out what comes next, but it's incredibly exciting work that we're doing all over the country. And we're doing it really in a very grassroots way, getting ideas from local communities, and it's just been amazing.
That's fantastic. I feel like it's also exciting because we have so many more tools to talk about when we're reconnecting highways. You know, it used to be just, oh, let's put a big park there, put a park there, put a park there. Now we have EV charging and micro hubs and kind of all these other exciting things that can help communities, and maybe from a land use perspective, you know, might be a little bit of a better fit, at least during this transition period.
No, for sure. I mean, I think the state of the art in thinking about how we re-envision reconnecting communities, there are just so many amazing ideas on the table. But, you know, there's also some challenges. Some communities, you know, there's a famous one, Tulsa, Oklahoma, the famous Greenwood neighborhood, which is notorious as a place where a terrible massacre happened over 100 years ago. Race massacre. And then tragically, after destroying what was known as Black Wall Street, they came in and sort of ran an interstate through the middle of it to finish the job. And now we're helping to work with the local community to envision what next. But, you know, there's not necessarily a shared vision, and there's an understandable concern in a lot of communities. We don't want to, let's say, tear the highway down and then the neighborhood just gentrifies and the people who've been here for generations can't afford to live there. So you really got to get not only the transportation pieces right, but the planning, the housing, the economic development. You've got to really have holistic approaches now. And as you say, Emily, with new transportation modes on the table too.
how do we get the people in those lower income communities recognizing that there is something that is being done to fix some of these things? Because I know sometimes it doesn't trickle down to those set communities that have been impacted.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, I learned a lot of great lessons about that here in New York City.
Okay.
You know, what this agency did, with street ambassadors, with finding people who could speak a lot of local languages, who, you know, went to bus stops and places where you could get working people who weren't going to have the time necessarily to come to a town hall meeting or get on Zoom. You know, a lot of that is really meeting people where they are. You know, we're trying to encourage that kind of public participation nationally. And we've actually put out a lot of standards where we're really trying to hold communities' feet to the fire to do a better job on that. You know, if we're designing these projects and we don't have local voices at the table, then we have not succeeded in our work.
So curious, drawing again from your experience at New York City DOT, roadway safety is fundamental. So very curious how you kind of took some experience and lessons learned and translated it as you went back to the federal level, and also started the Safe Streets and Roads for All program.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, having been here when we started Vision Zero in this city, I learned so much from the experience. And, the approach in New York, that very holistic approach, design, education, enforcement done, I think, in a smart, strategic, and data-driven way, working with, here locally, the city council and the state legislature. I think now you just got Sammy's Law and speed limits, speed cameras, you name it, just sort of tackling the problem from every dimension. We've really tried to now do that. I've tried to infuse that in what we do at the federal level. We have a national roadway safety strategy, which tries to pick at every single piece, and things that we particularly can do at the federal level, one of those being vehicle design, which is also a huge piece of safety. Back in the 70s, when we started really mandating seatbelts and started putting in airbags, we saw a tremendous drop in roadway fatalities. We haven't had anything come along since that has quite
that impact,
given that same impact. And, as you all know, for a while we were starting to sort of see nationally roadway fatalities somewhat trend down, not as much as they needed to. COVID, they went back up again. And we at the national level were around 43,000 fatalities a year. And you guys know, you've heard me say it. I mean, obviously those aren't just numbers.
Right.
It's our family, our friends, our neighbors, our coworkers, our fellow Americans. I am happy to say we are now seeing nationally, at least, we've had 7 quarters where the fatality numbers have trended down. And look, I've learned in this field, you never want to take a victory lap. There's always more work to do. But I do think some of the work that communities are doing all around the country is really making a difference. And Safe Streets for All is a perfect example of that. It's a program, dollars are only available to localities. They don't go through the states. And we tried very much to make the program, as much as it can be in the federal context, nimble. Like you didn't have to do a 100-page application. We wanted to really encourage experimentation, really taking the playbook from here in New York, like just get out there with some paint and some delineators and try some things. And it's been great because part of that has really been now, there's a whole group of communities all around the country that are doing the planning of this work, and they've sort of formed their own community of practice. Some are very sophisticated, some are doing New York style stuff, this is brand new work for them. And even just for them to start doing some of that data gathering to figure out what's the most dangerous road in my community. Even just starting that process, I think, is really going to be transformative in terms of roadway safety. So, thanks to my time here in New York and obviously working with a lot of other cities, I think there is a lot of fantastic expertise about how we make our streets safer, but a lot of work still to do.
What sparked your fascination with transportation?
I mean, I've said this before. I mean, it's funny. I went to college here in New York. I went to Barnard, up at Columbia University back in the 80s, which is, a very different time in the city's history when the city was really struggling, very high crime, and the subway system was kind of at its low ebb. But work was starting to reinvest and renew it. And over the years, it was transformative. It was the start of the city's renaissance. It was quite extraordinary. At that time, like everyone in New York, I read The Power Broker, which was a book, I think, for me and many, many other people that just made a huge impression. I mean, speaking of reconnecting communities, just to read about, the deep history of what happened here in New York, what did happen with the BQE and the Cross Bronx, the neighborhoods that were, basically destroyed in the process, the disinvestment in mass transit, and just realizing that history. And again, it didn't just play out in New York. There are versions of that in
Right.
cities all over the country. And how do we turn that around? And, it is fun now to be part of an administration that is really affirmatively committed to turning that around, is affirmatively committed to equity in transportation, that is looking to tackle climate change, that is that is an administration that's working closely with a lot of cities, but also with rural communities and tribal communities, really trying to get, I think, the dollars and the expertise down on the ground. So that was sort of, for me, what got me interested in it. And I'm lucky. I mean, I've had a wonderful career. I got to work on Capitol Hill for many years. I was with one of my old bosses just recently, Senator Schumer, again, for the Gateway announcement. I worked also for Senator Moynihan, did a lot of transportation for them. and then was at USDOT during the Obama administration. And then obviously I got the dream job of all dream jobs to come here and be commissioner for 7 years, which was an amazing, incredible, life-changing experience. I mean, I will say this, you all know this because here you are, obviously the fun of being at the local level is you see your work every day. And you are so close to the people it impacts. Look, for better or for worse, sometimes they love you and sometimes not so much, but there's nothing like that. And obviously work for Secretary Buttigieg, who's a wonderful secretary, and work for a president who he really loves infrastructure. I mean, it's a joke. They call him Amtrak Joe, but he really is. He loves it and gets it in a way that I think is pretty uncommon. And, in DOT, in the Obama years, we were an important agency, but now, particularly given all the resources of the bipartisan infrastructure law, we are really very front and center in this administration. And, getting to help fund projects in every corner of the country. And that's pretty magical. I'll mention just one other really wonderful career thing I got to do, unexpected, but incredible. Last year I had the chance, we had the administrator of the FAA left somewhat quickly, and I had the opportunity to fill in as acting administrator. It was an incredible experience. People often don't realize that the FAA, you don't always think that much of, you sort of take it for granted, like you do for a lot of things that happen at the city level. The FAA runs the largest, complex, 24/7 safety critical operation in the federal government. Wow. Which means maybe in the world. If you think about the breadth and the scope of all the towers and TRACONs and radars and facilities that run the air traffic control system around the whole country, and by the way, connect with air traffic control systems all around the world. It's an incredible system. And it was funny, coming from city government, I think it gave me kind of an outsider's perspective. Part of the outsider's perspective being, we have this massive, massive set of capital assets, and we're not investing as we should. The FAA doesn't have a 10-year capital plan like New York City DOT did. So I've become a big advocate of making sure that agency has the resources and the financial certainty, which is more challenging at the federal level, to maintain and modernize this incredible aviation system, which is, responsible for a decent chunk of our country's GDP and, millions of jobs.
Could you share your experiences navigating through what is traditionally seen as a male-dominating field?
Yes. Well, you guys may have your own thoughts on that question. It's an interesting thing. I think this agency, to me, is an interesting example of how the field has changed over the years. For many, many, many decades, transportation leaders were often engineers. And for many, many decades, women weren't really particularly encouraged to be engineers. By the way, particularly women of color, least of all. Yes. At a certain point, it started really with Iris Weinshall and then Jeanette Zodikon, and then there became a new model of what a transportation leader could look like. Could be someone who maybe had a broader sort of set of different types of skills, political skills, planning skills, budgetary knowledge, and I think that coincided with sort of transportation becoming less about just an engineering discipline and more, again, about the things we're talking about, how you bring the community in, how a new generation wants to have a multimodal experience, how technology started to become important, and how inherently political this discipline is. So I think it has become a field that's definitely changing and transforming, and I think opening more doors, and more women are going into traditional disciplines like engineering, et cetera. My theory on it is, come in and be that role model, and particularly, help women reach their potential. I think I can even think of a couple of them here, and maybe in some of my other roles where an important job opened up, and the woman who's clearly the right person for the job would be hesitating. I'm not sure I have all the qualifications,
Yes, we do that a lot.
We do, and I feel like it's upon us personally to be like, you can do it. Apply for the job. You're going to be great. And by the way, every time I've done that, they're always great.
Okay.
It's interesting.
Good advice.
It's good advice. And by the way, I haven't even always taken it myself. So it's easy advice to dish out.
Right.
We don't always take it ourselves. But just here's an interesting analogy. There are much fewer women in office than men. Fewer women run than men. But when they run, they're more likely to win. So it's getting over that hurdle, and that's not just true in transportation. I mean, that's
in
sort
life.
of true in general, but in transportation, it's getting over those hurdles. And look, I don't know, I'm sitting across the table from two very talented women who I'm sure could tell a few stories themselves about making it in this field.
But it's good to have a role model to emulate as well.
And I'll say something about that too. It's funny, I get asked that question, Natasha, like, tell us about your mentors. And I have had some, interesting enough, main mentors in my life have all been men. But for me, I think part of what has really helped me in my career has been my peers.
Okay.
It's really been my colleagues, particularly in some cases, my women peers. But, when I was a commissioner here, I love spending time with my fellow commissioners.
Okay.
Now that I'm deputy secretary, I love spending time with my fellow deputies. In some ways, it's people that are kind of going through the same things that you are, who can really be, in some ways, your greatest sounding boards and your greatest champions, and sometimes your greatest reality checkers, too.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to go back to a little bit what you were explaining about your kind of experience at being at the city and kind of having that local, seeing your change every day scale. You've held really important roles kind of at all different levels of government. And so just curious, your thoughts on the different scale, the different perspective that you get at kind of each of those levels of government, and if there are some kind of additional lessons learned, or what is the context perspective that has given you that really kind of shapes your value in your work?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it has been just fantastically useful to have had a bunch of diverse experience. Time on Capitol Hill, the honor of running New York City DOT, of being on the MTA board, of having been at US DOT as assistant secretary and undersecretary, and now as deputy secretary. All those different roles can help kind of infuse your thinking. I mean, it was funny you may remember this, when I first came here from Washington, there were some urban myths kicking around this place about how things worked in Washington and how you got money or what the MUTCD required you to do or not do. And it was just useful for me to say, well, wait a minute, it doesn't quite work that way. And if we want to get federal dollars, here's some tips on how we might succeed. Likewise, particularly now in this role, I can speak with real authority, having run a big operational agency. I'm thinking, looking over at the Staten Island Ferry, to obviously the big inventory of roads and bridges, to things like Vision Zero, the work we did during COVID, just, having had that operational experience, because a lot of people in Washington don't have that necessarily. And so it's just absolutely invaluable. And again, it sort of provides that, well, here's this thing we're going to tell every state or city to do. And you'll be like, can I just tell you that's like an incredibly difficult, burdensome, complicated thing. Let's think through whether we really want to make folks do that or not.
Many of our listeners are engaged in the transportation or urban planning fields and know how difficult it is to take an idea and bring it to fruition. What advice do you have for advocates or those who work in government to build stakeholder support and marshal the resources needed to take an idea and make it a reality?
Well, I think you two probably know how to do that as well as I do. I think it's like we've been talking about. It's incredibly important to get local voices at the table. And, one thing we always used to talk about, I know when I was here, is even when you'd have your challenging moments in front of community boards and maybe the crowd was not on your side, I think in every case, hearing those local voices, those local thoughts, always made the projects better. And, again, I think one thing I really learned from my time here, and I have tried to bring it to the federal government, is that sense of nimbleness, of experimentation, of piloting. I mean, that's an incredible way, right, that you can sort of start to get projects in the ground. And again, we really thought about that for Safe Roads for All. You don't have to do a massive redesign of every single street. Let's try a couple and let people see what it's like.
Yes.
Now, that said, there are also as we like to call them, the big cathedral projects. Gateway is one. I mean, there are all around the country. We're doing high-speed rail. We're doing major bridges. We're doing a whole bunch of work on the Northeast Corridor. I mean, there are some big, complex projects, and they take time to deliver.
Right.
But, their sheer doggedness is always a good ingredient. A talented team that keeps at it. And Gateway is a great example. It's had a lot of near-death experiences back from when then New Jersey Governor Chris Christie back in 2010 pulled the plug on the project. But people kind of kept at it. And the moment came where you had an administration and a president who are committed to a renaissance in passenger rail. You had an amazing majority leader, Chuck Schumer, two governors, Governor Hochul and Murphy, who have, I think, a wonderful partnership. You had dollars on the table because of the bipartisan infrastructure law. And because people had been planning and keeping the work going, we were able to meet the moment and make it happen.
I have to ask you a very serious question. New York-centric related.
Of course.
What is the most annoying breach of subway etiquette that you could tell us?
Oh, that's a dicey question. So when I was here, you all may remember this, it's a perennial debate about whether people should eat in the subway. And it's funny, by the way, in DC, people don't eat in the subways. That said, I remember actually at that time, Mayor de Blasio, I think, made it a forceful case that, for people who live, let's say, sort of far-flung corners of the city, working people have to commute in, they have to grab breakfast on the train. And I felt like that was a fair point to make. So I think subway etiquette, though, and the joke is like, if you have to eat a sandwich or something on the subway, that's fine. But like, if you're bringing like a sprawling Indian meal that flies to every corner of the train, as I have seen many times, that is definitely a breach of subway etiquette.
That was one of mine.
Yeah, if you're going to eat on the train, you got to keep it contained.
Yes.
All right. And finally, one question that we ask every guest. In thinking about the future of transportation, what is something that you are most enthusiastic about?
Yeah. The younger generation. I mean, I think the thing that I love about this field is you can really see generationally how much it's changed, from, my generation, more kind of autocentric and, maybe not necessarily that embracing of new technologies, to generations who, they view transportation as a service. They're ready to hop on a bike, a scooter, that they have a whole different relationship to how transportation is in their lives. They're also more climate conscious and more tech savvy. And that, I think, is just changing the field in really exciting, amazing ways. So it's fun. I am a big believer in the workplace. It is great to have the different generations. And all of them bring like incredible strengths and perspectives. But the younger generation in transportation is really amazing. I think you guys are you're gonna transform the field. But I would just say in general, I mean, one thing I also just like about transportation, it's a cliche to say, but it's a team sport. It's a field where you need to draw on the talents of a lot of different people. And the fun thing about here at New York City DOT, it's true at the federal level too. In big agencies, you just have an amazing diversity of people with an amazing diversity of skills and talents and experiences. And that's the most fun. And that's where I think, you make the magic happen.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Great. Well, thank you so much for your time and your leadership. Really appreciate it.
All right. Well, Emily and Natasha, thank you guys. Good interview. And thanks for all you're doing for New York City.
Thanks.